Today, I will be interpreting Siddhartha. This is a profound work by German author Hermann Hesse, a Nobel Prize in Literature laureate, and is a book of the soul that enlightens people to find themselves. 40 years after its publication, it resonated with the soul-searching generation of hippies, became a favorite of Beat Generation writer Henry Miller, and inspired the rock band Radiohead and legendary rocker Nick Drake. Today, it is still often said that writers and readers have read it repeatedly during their most confused times. You might already know that the name Siddhartha is linked to the founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, with Gautama being his family name and Siddhartha his given name. There are legends about how Siddhartha Gautama renounced his princely life to attain enlightenment. It is said that he was a prince in India, sheltered and unaware of life's hardships until he ventured beyond his palace gates and was confronted with the realities of aging, illness, and death. Profoundly moved, he abandoned everything to embark on a path of asceticism and eventually reached enlightenment. However, it's important to remember that Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha is not the biography of Siddhartha Gautama but a novel. In this book, Hesse creates a seeker named Siddhartha who pursues enlightenment in his own unique way, following a path quite different from that of the historical Siddhartha Gautama, a path fraught with hardship and brambles. In reality, Buddhist teachings offer an explanation for the world aimed at liberating beings from the cycle of suffering. In the novel, Siddhartha's ideas eventually transcend Buddhism, leading to a synthesis of global spiritual understanding. Now, I would like to discuss three aspects of Siddhartha's story. This distinctive seeker's life unfolds in three phases. Initially, he is a young man who renounces the world, embracing asceticism. Later, as a middle-aged man, he indulges in worldly pleasures, becomes disillusioned, and considers ending his life. Finally, he is an old man with nothing, working as a ferryman by a river, where he finds inner peace and enlightenment. So, let's start from the beginning and follow Siddhartha as he renounces the world, engages with it, finds himself, and ultimately becomes his true self. Part 1. Siddhartha was born into a Brahmin family in ancient India. The Brahmins were the highest caste, a noble class tasked with serving the divine and conducting rituals. Siddhartha was the epitome of perfection, handsome, strong, graceful, intelligent, with a strong sense of duty and lofty thoughts. He was a thirster for knowledge, spending his days debating with friends, studying meditation and contemplation, and pondering the ultimate questions of life. He was the pride of his parents and the treasure of his friends. Everyone believed his life was set. He would become a great sage and priest, a king among the Brahmins. But here's the twist. Siddhartha was not happy. He had mastered the teachings imparted by his father and the other Brahmin sages, yet he felt spiritually empty and restless. He encountered a profound philosophical dilemma concerning Atman, which can mean self or the essence of the universe. The idea that self and universal essence are referred to by the same word, similar to the Chinese concept of the unity of heaven and man, also approaches what Carl Jung described as individuation, which we'll discuss later. Siddhartha's dilemma was that his self and the universal essence did not align philosophically. He had not achieved unity with the cosmos, which is quite normal since he was still a privileged young nobleman inexperienced in life. Siddhartha spent his days pondering Atman, so naturally he grew dissatisfied with the well-paved path of serving the divine laid out before him. He was destined to be a rebel, to carve out his own path. That day came. One day, 3 wandering ascetics passed through Siddhartha's city. That evening, Siddhartha told his best friend Govinda, also a Brahmin and a childhood companion, that he would leave with the ascetics the next morning to become an ascetic himself. Govinda, who shared Siddhartha's ideals and looked up to him as a divine figure, was shocked but understood that Siddhartha needed to follow his own path and decided to join him. Siddhartha became an ascetic, living a life of deprivation in the forest, eating only once a day, raw food, clad only in a loincloth and a cloak. When he went to the city to beg, he saw nobles, merchants, rulers, people being born, dying, aging, suffering, loving, and prostituting themselves. He thought all desires, happiness, and beauty were illusions. Life was suffering and torment. Up to this point, the story of Siddhartha in the novel parallels the historical tale of Siddhartha Gautama. But from here, it diverges. Siddhartha and the ascetics practiced self-denial, suppressing desires. One method was meditation, effectively stifling the senses. They practiced slowing their breathing to nearly stopping, slowing their heartbeats to nearly ceasing. Then, they practiced detaching from the self and merging with the cosmos. For example, seeing an eagle flying over the forest, Siddhartha's soul would become the eagle, soaring over mountains and forests, enduring hunger, crying in sorrow and dying. Seeing the corpse of a wolf, his soul would enter the wolf's body, decompose, be eaten by eagles, and return to the earth. Another method was suffering. By willingly enduring suffering, they learned to overcome pain, hunger, and fatigue. Through these methods, Siddhartha learned to deny himself. However, he realized that this was not the ultimate way, because even after denying himself thousands of times, he always returned to self, enduring the suffering of samsara. He told Govinda that what they learned from the ascetics was merely an escape from self, a temporary anesthetic that did not truly liberate one from the void and pain of life, and could not lead to true wisdom or a higher spiritual state. He felt doubtful and weary. After 3 years of rigorous asceticism, a rumor spread throughout the country that a man named Gautama had appeared, claiming to be the enlightened Buddha, a realized being who had attained nirvana and escaped the suffering of samsara. He was now preaching in the city of Sarnath and had many disciples. This time, it was Govinda who was moved. He said to Siddhartha, "We must go and see and hear this Buddha preach for ourselves." Siddhartha replied, "I thought you wanted to remain an ascetic forever, but it seems you too are seeking a new path." Thus, Siddhartha and Govinda left the ascetics and set out again. They arrived in Sarnath and saw the revered Buddha Gautama. His entrance in the novel is quite moving. His face was serene, neither joyful nor sad, as if a gentle smile was blossoming from within. His face, gait, lowered eyelids, hanging arms, even each finger exuded peace and perfection. A particularly important description said that Buddha had no desires to satisfy, nothing to emulate. He didn't need to imitate anyone. He had already become himself, the ultimate state that all seekers of knowledge and truth aspire to. That day, Siddhartha and Govinda listened to the Buddha's preaching. After the sermon, some pilgrims approached and converted to follow Gautama, including Govinda. But Siddhartha did not convert. Govinda, puzzled, asked, "Don't you want to walk the path of liberation? Are you still hesitating, waiting?" Siddhartha solemnly replied, "Govinda, my friend, you have listened to your heart and chosen your path. May you find liberation. But I, tomorrow, will leave you." Govinda wept bitterly, continuously asking Siddhartha if he had found any flaws in the Buddha's teachings. But Siddhartha always answered, "There are no flaws." The next day, he left Govinda. As Siddhartha walked thoughtfully into the forest, he encountered Gautama and spoke movingly. He said, "World-honored one, please forgive my audacity in speaking thus. but I find your teachings to be perfect. You have explained the world as an eternal chain of cause and effect, so clear in your teachings, unarguable, flawless. However, this perfection is not truly without flaws, for you have attained enlightenment through your own lifetime of exploration, deep observation, meditation, understanding, and realization, not through teachings. In fact, no one can achieve liberation through teachings alone. If I were to convert, I fear I would only achieve peace and liberation superficially. Therefore, I must continue my quest for truth, not in search of better teachings, but to free myself from all sages and teachings, to achieve my goal alone, or perhaps to achieve disillusionment. At that moment the Buddha said to Siddhartha, "You are very wise, but beware of being too wise." After saying this, the Buddha slowly walked away, his gaze and mysterious smile imprinting themselves in Siddhartha's heart. It was the gaze and smile of a realized being. Siddhartha thought, only those who delve deeply into themselves can have such a sincere gaze. I hope I, too, can have such a gaze and smile, and without a doubt, I will also delve deeply into myself to seek. As mentioned before, Siddhartha had spent 3 years with the ascetics, learning to deny himself. Now, facing Gautama, he suddenly awakened and rediscovered his self. He thought, I have been contemplating the cosmic truth of Atman all day, yet I lost myself on this path. The thing I understand least in this world is myself, and the self is Atman. Therefore, he decided to seek his self in the worldly life, to live out his self. The first half of the novel ends here. In this part, Siddhartha goes from contemplating the self, denying the self, returning to the self, and seeking the self. This is a path of becoming oneself, a path inevitably fraught with thorns. The young Siddhartha constantly sought teachings and guidance. After encountering Buddha Gautama, the peak of seekers, he provided the world with a perfect explanation, thus transcending all beings. However, Siddhartha still harbored doubts and chose to continue being a seeker. This is because he realized a paradox encountered by all seekers of knowledge. Wisdom cannot be imparted, only knowledge can. To achieve the kind of comprehensive wisdom that Buddha had, without imitation, one must personally experience and explore everything. Of course, Buddha's advice to not be too clever is also correct. Young seekers with the arrogance of the inexperienced set out to find their own paths and are likely to fail miserably. This leads us to the second part of our discussion. Part 2. Siddhartha, having abandoned his faith and teacher, was reborn. Previously, he had no regard for the material world. As the saying goes, a mountain is not a mountain, water is not water. Now, he had reached a new state where a mountain is a mountain, water is water. He looked at the world with the wonder of a newborn, finding everything beautiful and intriguing. Of course, he inevitably wanted to taste all that the mundane world had to offer, such as love, beauty, money, and power. Siddhartha crossed a river and entered a city, where he was first attracted by the beauty of a famous courtesan named Kamala. He fell in love with her at first sight and decided to learn the art of love from this beautiful woman. His courtship was naturally scoffed at by Kamala, who said, "You are just a monk. You need to be rich, dressed in fine clothes and shoes, and bring gifts to see me." She introduced Siddhartha to a man named Kamaswami, the richest merchant in town, and thus Siddhartha began to learn business from him. We know Siddhartha was intelligent and well-learned, and he quickly grasped the ways of the mundane world, which seemed like a game to him. As long as he learned the rules, he didn't care much about the content. Thus, Siddhartha quickly amassed wealth, but he did so only to make Kamala happy, having no passion for wealth itself. Kamala taught him everything about love, and he often indulged excessively, falling into the abyss of sensuality. He became addicted to the techniques of love but did not understand what love was, because Kamala did not understand either. At this stage, Siddhartha immersed himself in the secular world, learning the knowledge of desire and money. He lived, worked, and enjoyed himself, but he still had the soul of a renunciate, always an observer of life. He never forgot Buddha Gautama, telling Kamala that most people in the world are like fallen leaves, swaying in the wind and eventually returning to dust, while a rare few are like stars in the sky, following their own internal laws and paths, unshaken by any wind. I know such a perfectly awakened being, the world-honored Buddha Gautama. Thousands of followers listen to his teachings every day, but these followers are like fallen leaves, without their own doctrines or laws. However, no matter how aware Siddhartha was, he was still a mortal. As time passed, he became very wealthy, but he almost became one of those fallen leaves. He often spent nights reveling, drinking, and gambling. Kamala had long fallen in love with him, but he spent his days seeking pleasure with dancing girls. In short, the middle-aged Siddhartha lived out his self, a wealthy man, a libertine. Siddhartha became the very person he had once despised. His face was marked with insatiable desires and deep weariness, the soul sickness of the wealthy afflicting him, and he felt sad for himself. He knew that over the years he had worked hard to become a worldly person, but because he always harbored the lofty goals of a seeker, this made him even poorer and more unfortunate than those less fortunate worldly people. He realized that the game of the secular world had to end. That night, he left Kamala and left the city. Soon after, Kamala discovered she was pregnant with Siddhartha's child. The pain of being abandoned made her think of the saintly Gautama, and she converted to Buddhism. Let's continue with Siddhartha's story. He hated his sins and went to the river, intending to kill himself. Just as he was about to jump into the water, a sacred sound suddenly came, the Om he had chanted day and night in his youth. He realized he still had an unfulfilled mission, and his soul awakened. Here, an explanation is needed. Om is the fundamental sound in Sanskrit from which the world is said to have emerged. In ancient Indian tradition, practitioners can experience Atman, or the unity of heaven and man individuation, through the Om in the Vedas. After reawakening, Siddhartha fell asleep by the river. When he woke up, he found a monk sitting across from him, whom he quickly recognized as his old friend Govinda. Govinda said he saw someone sleeping under a tree and, fearing the person might be attacked by wild animals, sat down to guard him. However, Govinda did not recognize Siddhartha, as he was dressed in luxurious clothes and had the face of a wealthy man tired of indulgence. Govinda acted like a mirror, reflecting Siddhartha's self. Looking at Govinda, this mirror, Siddhartha began to reflect on his life choices and gained new insights. He thought, "What a strange and twisted path I have walked, but it is also very beautiful, because I have known since childhood that sensuality and wealth are not good, but only by experiencing them personally could I truly understand this." He felt that only by experiencing complete degradation could he kill the self that was the wealthy man and libertine and rediscover the Atman within his heart. At that moment, he no longer hated himself. His heart was filled with joy. Thus, he entered a new phase of his spiritual journey. Part 3. Siddhartha fell in love with the river and decided to live by its banks. When he had left Buddha to enter the worldly life, it had all started from this river. At that time, the ferryman who had taken him across the river said that he often listened to the river's sounds and had learned many things from the river, namely, that everything returns. So when Siddhartha had no money to pay him, the ferryman said, "You will come again next time." Crossing the river here is clearly a symbol, meaning to ferry you to the other shore of wisdom. Indeed, this time, Siddhartha met the ferryman again. It had been over 20 years since the last crossing. This time, Siddhartha was still penniless, so he took off his luxurious robe and gave it to the ferryman, who then recognized Siddhartha. The two greeted each other like old friends. Siddhartha talked about his experiences over the past 20 years into the night, and the ferryman listened attentively, without judgment. Finally, Siddhartha said, "You are the best listener I have ever met, a great virtue I wish to learn from." The ferryman replied, "I learned to listen from the river, and you should learn from it too." This ferryman is quite interesting and deserves further mention. His name is Vasudeva, and he is also a realized being, similar to a sweeping monk. He attained enlightenment by listening to the river day after day for decades, but he was not eloquent and could not express it. We often say, precept and example. If the revered Buddha Gautama, whom people admire, is skilled in teaching through words, then this ferryman, Vasudeva, is skilled in teaching through example. For decades, he had no systematic doctrine but continuously enlightened beings, ferrying millions of people across the river, that is, ferrying millions to the other shore of wisdom, which is essentially the same goal as Buddha's teaching. Indeed, the ferryman's way of enlightening people is very similar to Chinese Zen. Returning to Siddhartha, he followed the ferryman, became a ferryman himself, and led a down-to-earth life. He learned to listen to the river, to listen to all things, thinking he had mastered the art of listening. Yet, he faced another test. First, he encountered Kamala, who had gone to worship Buddha but unfortunately was bitten by a snake and died. Then, he learned that he had a son. As mentioned earlier, when Siddhartha was with Kamala, he did not understand love. He loved no one. Now, he understood and felt a strong love for his son. But his son did not love him and even hated him. This was because Siddhartha wanted his son to follow a good path, to practice with him, to listen to the river, but his son insisted on following a bad path, pursuing worldly pleasures. His son became Siddhartha's greatest vulnerability. He knew intellectually everything that could not be put into practice. He understood intellectually that his son also needed to follow his own path to truly understand good and evil, but he could not bear to see his son make mistakes and was unwilling to let go. Eventually, his son ran away, and Siddhartha was in immense pain, his love turning into a wound that could not heal. This time, he attained enlightenment through the suffering of mortals. He listened to the river again, and this time he heard the suffering of others. He saw the disappointment and loneliness of his father after he left home, the anxiety of his son facing worldly temptations, and realized that everyone is walking their own path. The mistakes of predecessors are still made by successors, and everyone inevitably causes trauma to others. This time, he truly understood from his heart that all beings suffer. Thus, he stopped licking his own wounds and began to feel compassion for all beings. Siddhartha heard a unified and integrated voice from the river. He understood that there is no binary opposition. Everything merges harmoniously, just like a river. He heard the eternal peace in the river. For the river, time does not exist, only the present, and life is also a river, eternal, yet always new. Therefore, reincarnation is not, as Buddhism says, a repetition of suffering, but a rebirth each time. At this moment, Siddhartha's self merged into the unity, achieving the harmony of heaven and man completely realized. Then, his teacher Vasudeva said, "I have been waiting for this moment. Now let me go, bless you, Siddhartha." With that, he entered the forest and disappeared. The final section returns to Govinda. He is now old, has followed doctrines and rules all his life, respected by people, but has not attained enlightenment. He heard that a ferryman was a saint and went to visit only to encounter the elderly Siddhartha. This time, Govinda did not recognize his friend. The last time they met, Siddhartha was a wealthy man sleeping by the river, but this time he was a ragged ferryman. After hearing Siddhartha recount his life's adventures, Govinda asked a question. After all these years, do you have your own teachings? Do you have a faith or knowledge that guides you? Siddhartha replied, in my youth, I doubted and abandoned various teachings and teachers, but since then I have had many teachers. For example, a beautiful courtesan, a rich merchant, several gamblers, and you who once guarded me by the river. However, I learned the most from this river and my predecessor, the ferryman Vasudeva, a simple man. But his understanding of life is as deep as that of Buddha Gautama. He is a perfect being, a saint. And Buddha Gautama, Siddhartha believes, his greatness lies not in his teachings and thoughts, but in his life. Siddhartha's words Govinda could not understand, but he knew that his old friend had attained enlightenment, while he himself was still suffering. As they were parting, Govinda hoped Siddhartha would speak a few more words to help him attain enlightenment. At that moment, Siddhartha asked Govinda to kiss his forehead. Govinda was surprised but complied. At that moment, a miracle occurred. Instantly, Govinda saw everything Siddhartha had seen when he attained enlightenment. He saw the river of beings, all things, the cycle of reincarnation, the gods, all love and hate, death, and rebirth. All this was contained in Siddhartha's face, the face of those who are becoming, those who exist, and those who have passed. And Siddhartha's smile was the smile of Buddha Gautama, the smile of a realized being. At that moment, Govinda attained enlightenment. To explain, Govinda's path had already proven the uselessness of verbal transmission. He again asked Siddhartha to use words to help him attain enlightenment, which was naturally impossible. Thus, Siddhartha used the method of example, helping Govinda to attain enlightenment, and the magic that allowed Govinda to attain enlightenment was actually Siddhartha's love, a type of love between people that Buddha had not taught. But Siddhartha said Buddha understood love. This concludes the story. In this book, Hesse cleverly split the name of Siddhartha Gautama into two people, one named Siddhartha, a seeker, not yet realized, and the other named Gautama, a realized and accomplished being. Siddhartha's life was a journey towards becoming Gautama, and in the end, he became himself. Siddhartha awakened 5 times in total. The first time, he left his Brahmin family to become an ascetic. The second time, he left the ascetics to follow Buddha. The third time, he left Buddha to seek the self. The fourth time, he left the libertine and wealthy Siddhartha, intending to kill himself. The fifth time, he learned to listen to the river from the ferryman and finally achieved greatness, reaching the highest realm of sainthood, a philosophy of seeking knowledge and truth, not a philosophy full of concepts and logic, but a philosophy of life. Lastly, I want to talk about the seeker's story beyond the book. In fact, Hesse's Siddhartha in the book is himself. Hesse's grandfather and father were Christian missionaries who preached in India for many years, and Hesse attended a church school as a child. He was supposed to become a priest, but he threatened suicide and left the path arranged by his parents to follow his own path. He read extensively, blending Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism, Laozi, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer's philosophy into a unique aspect of what could be called world spirit in his writing. This path was destined to be very lonely. While writing this book, Hesse wrote the earlier parts smoothly, but when he wrote the part about enlightenment, he exhausted his mental energy and experienced a mental breakdown. Fortunately, he encountered a soul very similar to his own, the psychologist Carl Jung. Jung and Hesse were similar in age and experience. Jung had abandoned his own teacher Freud to follow his own path, also blending various teachings and world spirits, and had experienced a mental breakdown during his exploration. Later, he became an accomplished being, healing wounded souls and ferrying millions to the other side. Jung was like the two realized saints in Hesse's writing, Buddha Gautama and the ferryman Vasudeva. His guidance healed Hesse's soul, helped him attain enlightenment, and allowed him to complete this book and all his later works, ultimately winning the Nobel Prize and becoming a realized being in the field of literature. As mentioned earlier, the Atman that Siddhartha pondered and sought in Hesse's writing is very close to a concept in Jungian psychology, individuation. In Jung's theory, self is divided into ego and self. Simply put, ego is the small self, and self is the great self of unity of heaven and man, also known as individuation. Individuation represents the integrated state of personality, implying the ultimate perfection of personality. In the book, the individuation that Siddhartha initially wanted to understand was the mystery of the self, which he perceived from Buddha's smile as the unified self, individuation. But to reach individuation, one must first understand the self, ego. Therefore, Siddhartha learned to deny ego among the ascetics. When he indulged in the secular world, the libertine and wealthy man he lived out was his ego, and his desire for his son to follow his path was also his ego. In the end, he also denied this ego, followed the ferryman, listened to the river, and realized the integration of past, present, and future, reconciling binary oppositions, eliminating time and the distinction between self and others, achieving individuation. In conclusion, this is the content of the book explained for you. In summary, Siddhartha discusses two issues. One is the realm of seeking knowledge. Siddhartha ultimately realized that wisdom cannot be transmitted through words. The teachings of the wise may seem empty to seekers, who think they understand but do not truly understand. True wisdom can only be obtained through personal experience. As the ancient saying goes, the ancients did not spare themselves in their studies. Those who work hard in their youth achieve results in old age. What is learned from books is ultimately shallow. One must personally practice to truly understand. The second issue is about the self, or the realm of life. In this matter, Hesse and Jung met. The saying, "Know yourself, become yourself," also involves a difficult process. One must move from the small self to the great self, from ego to individuation, achieving the perfection of personality. In summary, whether it is seeking knowledge or living life, in this book, both are the same thing, both a thorny and perilous path. But no one can walk this path for you. You must walk it yourself. Thank you for listening to this book. You can find the link to the book in the description below. If you want to listen to more books like this, leave your comments, give us a like, and subscribe.